This is the based science panel, right? Yes. Okay. Hans Schantz, I'll let you do your thing.
Okay, thank you for that introduction, Rob. This is the base science panel. We're going to look at whether modern science is living up to its promise and explore concrete examples of poor science, real-world impacts, and how we might make scientific inquiry better. I'm going to kick off the panel by asking my panelists to provide a brief introduction of themselves and their background in science, why you should listen to their distinguished opinions, and ask them to answer the question, should we trust the science? Why or why not? I'll start with Joe.
Good morning. Kicking things off. My name is Joe Lewis. I've been in the IT industry since, a long time. It's amazing how long. I'll tell you what keeps me young is my son's actually a senior at Purdue in IT, and we have dinner about twice a month, and we go over what he's learning, and I realize how much I know and what is new to him, and actually it's not new to me, but in my opinion, it's just my opinion, every man has one, you take it or leave it, but I've been a end user of science, and I've always done it. Matter of fact, I was talking about I took a physics class when I was in engineering, and kind of wrote a thing about disproving Newton's third law, and actually, I made a lot of my fellow students mad because I showed it mathematically, and got an A in that class, and no one else did. Anyway.
I'm Lowell Jacobson. In my day job, I am a patent lawyer. I've got a background in physics and electrical engineering, so day to day, I'm generally working on figuring out whether something is new or not, or working with experts to figure out whether something infringes or not. And as part of that job, I not only have to get into the science, and really it's more engineering than science, but I'm reading papers, I'm working with experts, I'm figuring out essentially what's bullshit and what's not bullshit. And in close to 20 years of doing this, I've developed a pretty finely honed bullshit detector from trying to poke holes in the other side's expert reports. So I wouldn't say I'm doing the science on the front lines, but I'm pretty much science adjacent and applying the science, or working with people who are applying the science pretty much day to day.
Buenos dias, me llamo John Plaice. I was born in Montreal and now live in Bogota. I studied pure math and computer science in Waterloo in Canada, and then got my PhD in Grenoble in France. I was university professor for 25 years, then I worked in private industry. I'm now officially retired, so that means I can do what I want. And so now I have a Substack on the history of science called Fiat Lux. The question is, should we trust the science? So this is a loaded question, as it presupposes that there is one science. So apologies to Tolkien. In the land of New Atlantis where the shadows lie, one science to rule them all, one science to find them, one science to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them. In the land of New Atlantis where the shadows lie. For me, science necessitates open debate. Where there is no debate, science has lost its way. One of the foci of my blog is to make apparent historic debates, typically from the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, as these allow us to understand the development of modern science and the debates of the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries. I have been doing this now for a bit over 2 years, and I have learned a lot. I'll leave it like that. I have 8 pages of notes, so if people want to throw the balls.
Thanks, John. My name is Schantz. My background is I earned degrees in industrial engineering and physics from Purdue University. I got my PhD in theoretical physics from the University of Texas at Austin. I discovered, to my great surprise, that theoretical electromagnetic physics is of very little practical use in the real world. So I had to work to get up to speed on applied electromagnetic physics and antenna engineering. I launched a career designing ultra-wideband antennas and doing wireless systems. I segued into doing near-field location systems in indoor environments, and I have been working in industry on a variety of wireless projects since then. I also discovered that the way we have been approaching electromagnetic science has serious flaws. That's what I'm exploring in my Fields and Energy project, and I'll be looking forward to talking with you more about that. Now, should we trust the science? Well, I think John said it very well. What science? Because there are a lot of people who are advocating their own particular versions of science to serve their own particular agendas, and we can address that in the next question, which I'll pose to the panelists. What examples or problems do you see in science? Problems or corruption or issues in the current state of science? Does anyone want to lead off on that one?
Sure, I can take that. So, this is a problem that was identified maybe 20 years ago, but, it's in the news because people don't understand it and everybody likes to have answers. So, if you want to go into particle physics past the Higgs boson and string theory, I will take the position that string theory is bullshit because it's not even science. A guy named Lee Smolin wrote a book about this maybe 20 years ago, and there's a woman named Sabine Essenfelder, I may be getting her last name wrong, who's on YouTube, who grew up in that milieu, and has been very active and vocal in talking about this, and I think she's largely correct. But essentially, string theory, in my opinion, isn't science because it's not falsifiable. It makes certain predictions, but at the end of the day, it's just mathematical masturbation. And people like this view because, the math is elegant, so it has to work out. And because the math is elegant and it's pretty, it therefore has to be reality. But there's really no way to falsify a lot of the predictions of string theory. Like, how do you disprove that there were 14 dimensions? I mean, or 17, or whatever flavor of string theory is currently in vogue. It's just math. And that's not to say math can't do a lot of useful things, but it's not science. I'm personally a pretty strict Popperian. I believe very strongly in the falsifiability criterion for what makes science. String theory is not it.
Yeah, actually, I don't think you were gonna get applause. Nice. I don't think it's a science problem. I think it's a people problem, and it's a mindset of activism that crept into. It's starting in the universities, going into the humanities, and then spreading there, and then getting into the sciences, unfortunately. And then those people end up into roles of government, doling out funds, which then becomes a perpetual feeding itself on, if I want to get funds for my project, I have to show that whatever I'm doing disproportionately affects, poor minorities and women, right? And if I could throw that in there, I'll get the funding. Unfortunately, this feeds upon itself. In fact, like the corporate climate, kind of dealing with, it's actually driven down to HR now, where these things are going through. And then you talk, about trust the science. You could tell people's mentality is about when Fauci just said, wear 2 masks. And all of a sudden you see people wearing 2 masks. And it just blindly did it like sheep. I think that was more of an experiment than anything else. But that's you know who was trusting the science. I think it's really just a people problem and the people who got into now that control the money for the sciences and what hoops people need to do to get funded. But I'll just leave with one thing here. There wasn't a dime of money given to the Wright brothers to create the flyer.
Just to piggyback on one thing you said, apparently, again, for those of us who are thankfully not particularly familiar with academia and its practices, there's apparently something that I think didn't really get off the ground but has been fairly active over the last few years called citational justice in scientific papers, and it's exactly what you think it is. It's DEI applied to what you're citing, and you need to be sure that you're citing enough women, enough minorities, enough disabled people, because they haven't had the chance to get up in the field and be cited, so you need to cite them, and you need to have a proportional citation set in your papers.
That's why. Your mic was off the whole time.
I'll project.
Are they? It's just too close.
That way a little bit.
I think we have to take a historical perspective on this. I think where science has demonstrated its complete untrustworthiness is its ability to falsify its own history. I'm old enough to remember the predictions made on television by the Club of Rome in 1972. I was only 9 years old at the time. And I was completely terrified about the future that these people had predicted for us. And it was only much later that I learned that the conclusions were built into the simulations. So there was no way to come up with anything but those conclusions. At the beginning of the 20th century, eugenics and cranial science were accepted widely in the scientific community. And leading scholars such as Sven Arrhenius, the father himself of the greenhouse theory, Nobel Prize in chemistry, was a firm believer of racial science. So these historical truths, you can find them on Wikipedia and confirm them. But there's other parts of the history of science which have simply been completely occulted. They're simply not there. So for example, when we study electricity and magnetism, and this is where Hans and I, we spar online, we read about Michael Faraday and James Clerk Maxwell, and William Thomson, aka Lord Kelvin or Baron Kelvin. And what has been erased from history is that starting, say, from 1851, at the time of the first international exhibition, Britain took upon itself to become the center of science. And to do this, they had to dismantle the existing structures of science on the continent, most importantly France and Germany. So over a period of several decades, the center of science moved from the European continent to Britain through a well-coordinated system led by William Thomson in Britain and Hermann von Helmholtz in Germany. The work by Augustin Jean Fresnel was turned inside out by George Gabriel Stokes. The work of André-Marie Ampère and Wilhelm Edvard Weber was overturned with false accusations that the latter's work violated the principle of conservation of energy. In my opinion, many of the craziest aspects of 20th century science, such as the string theory that was mentioned by my colleague, have their roots in that period, in the middle of the 19th century. I can elaborate later, but perhaps I can give one example that says how science can be conducted collectively. Over 15 years ago, at the time that the concerns about catastrophic anthropological global warming were on everyone's lips, the French Académie des Sciences held an all-hands meeting in camera that is, behind closed doors. It was announced by the, a number of positions were presented, and then a vote was held in the Academy. And it was announced by the Academy that sure enough, anthropological global warming is real, and it is catastrophic. Now, I know some of the people who participated in that meeting, including my master supervisor. I was scandalized. How is it possible that such an important debate was undertaken in secret with no published proceedings? In what way can we call this science?
Well, to add to what our panelists have said, there are a variety of issues and corruptions in science. There is a replication crisis where people have been unable to, people will make a claim, present a paper, it's widely accepted, and when people go back and double check the result or try to rerun the experiment, they discover that a high proportion of what were thought to be high quality scientific results actually need to be rethought or cannot be replicated. And to tie into what John said about climate science is an excellent example of this. There are perverse incentives in science to align the science with preconceived public policy notions. I'm also of an age where I remember when the Club of Rome came out with its predictions and grew up being taught in school and hearing through the popular press about how unbridled economic and industrial expansion were putting particulates into the atmosphere that were going to cause the glaciers to come back and bury us in ice. And unless we accepted centralized government control, we were going to face, another ice age coming. And then a decade later, of course, it was the exact reverse. And it turned out, however, where unbridled economic activity would cool the planet in the 1970s, that wasn't considered as a solution to the global warming crisis of the 1980s. And it became very clear that it was the policy result that was the preconceived bedrock conviction, and that the science was being modified in order to support it. And you can see that in the selective rewriting and corrections of the temperature history. For instance, we'll be told that the last year was the hottest summer on record, ignoring the fact that, say, the 1930s were a lot hotter. You'll see people talk about how the ice is the ice cap coverage is the lowest it's ever been in data going back to 1979, forgetting that 1979 was one of the highest ice pack years that has ever been, and we've got data for earlier, but it gets omitted. So, it's that corruption of science and the perverse incentives that lead us, or that lead scientists to concoct the science that mean you really shouldn't always trust the science. Let me move on to the third question I wanted to ask our panelists. How important is peer review to having high quality science? Is it quality control or is it merely gatekeeping? Who would like to lead us off on that one?
Oh, we'll dumb it down and go on up. I'll start. Consensus is for buying pizza. Not for science. It's the scientific method and methodology and that, and then of course checking the math. I just go. One of the stories is about Einstein. I don't remember which one it was, but it was talking about you had to see an eclipse to see that light bends with gravity, right? And he made that prediction, and then all of a sudden after that, how many people were running around the world trying to catch up to an eclipse, trying to prove or disprove his theory about with the bending of light, and And then once they saw it and observed it, and they're like, oh, that's true. Where do we have that? You don't hear these stories anymore, or at least I don't see these stories. But yeah, consensus building is really just for, where do you want to go hang out, or what do you want on your pizza? There's no place for it in science.
I mean, I sort of go back to something Glenn Reynolds said in the early days of the blogosphere, which is, fact checking is better than peer review. It may be that depending on your peer set, only a certain number of peers are actually able to check your facts. But I think it is the fact checking aspect of that rather than, to Joe's point, the consensus science, that is the useful aspect of that. I don't have the head for math that some people here have, so I wouldn't be able to necessarily find math errors in complex physics papers, but there are people who are able to do that. And so having them look over papers and finding those sorts of errors that don't support the conclusions does have a useful function. So I'm slightly less negative on it than Joe, but I agree that whether or not your peers accept your results is orthogonal to science.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Does it matter who those peers are, though?
I don't think it depends what you mean by who.
Yeah.
Hate to sound like a lawyer, but it is my job.
Comes with the territory.
Well done.
If peer review means that your colleagues read your work in order to find inconsistencies and flaws in your work, and that they act as a sounding board for you to better develop your ideas, I think we'd all be for peer review. But it would be hard for me to count the number of nonsense reviews that I have seen. A colleague and I once submitted a paper to an IEEE journal, and we referred to the possible world semantics of modal and intentional logic. Now, modal logic goes back at least to Aristotle, and possible worlds are a well-known concept in logic and philosophy going back at least to John Duns Scotus in the 14th century. Two reviewers, not one, wrote that we were trying to do science fiction with rockets to go between the different possible worlds. And such uncultured dolts are given the right to judge the works of other scientists. Fortunately, we were able to get to fight back and get the paper published. Now, this is what happens potentially at the micro level. But at the societal level, it's obvious that peer review serves two purposes. One is to push down our throats shoddy research for whatever nefarious political agenda, and to stop the development of good science because it's putting into question existing paradigm. Of course, history has shown that the alternatives to peer review can be quite dramatic. In 1428, after the Council of Constance, John Wycliffe's remains were exhumed and burnt because he claimed that a line is made up of an infinite set of points. In 1600, Giordano Bruno was burnt upside down, naked, masked in the Campo de' Fiori in Rome for daring to claim that the universe was infinite. In 1632, Galileo Galilei was condemned to house arrest for the remainder of his life for putting into question the results of the Council of Trent, which made Aristotelianism dogma. Ultimately, in 1651, the Jesuits condemned the study in divisibles and in atomism and set back Italian science for 2 centuries into the Risorgimento movement leading to Italian unification. And just in case you think that I'm picking on the Roman Church, in Geneva, Calvin had Michael Servetus roasted on a small fire for 2 whole hours. He was screaming the entire time, when the latter was on the verge of discovering the circulation of blood. It was taken up by Harvey, I think 50 years later. And it is amazing the number of carriage or automobile accidents involving scientists and mathematicians. Pierre Curie was killed in 1906. Nikola Tesla was hit by a taxi in New York in 1937. He didn't die, but his health substantially decreased afterwards. And then something I found as I was studying Leibniz versus Newton on the origins of the calculus, two of the editors of his mathematical correspondence, Dietrich Manke and Joseph Ehrenfried Hoffmann, both died in hit-and-run accidents. So peer review is perhaps not quite so bad as the alternatives.
And didn't von Neumann get in car accidents pretty regularly?
I don't know. Well, that's possible.
I think he did, but that's because he was a maniac driver.
Oh, okay.
Well, there's always been an issue with people with innovative ideas trying to get them in front of the public. Two separate incidences in the 19th century, Waterston and Herapath, both came up with the concept of statistical mechanics decades before Maxwell and others explored the concept. And in each case, the Royal Society refused to publish their work, saying that it was nonsense and discarding it. Ohm, who electrical engineers will be familiar with as the originator of Ohm's law. Ohm's law was so controversial at the time that Ohm resigned in disgrace at the reaction he received to his work and spent a decade in obscurity, in utter poverty, teaching, tutoring high school students effectively, until a number of foreign researchers discovered his work and popularized it and changed the assessment that his German colleagues had of his work. And Helmholtz, who came up with the concept of conservation of energy, he was unable to get that published in the leading journals of the day, so he self-published it and distributed his own little pamphlet with his writings and descriptions of conservation of energy. So there's always been a problem with gatekeeping in science. Now, peer review has become such a touchstone of this is how we do science, and good science requires peer review. It's important to recognize that that really wasn't something commonly done until just recent decades. Einstein went through his entire career without being peer reviewed at all. The editor would look at his paper and accept it. The one exception to that rule was in the 1930s, Einstein submitted a paper on gravitational waves to the Physical Review. The editor wasn't sure about the result and sent it for outside opinions, and then told Einstein he'd done it, and the outside reviewer had some issues or problems. Einstein was so offended that he withdrew the paper, saying he had not granted any permission for it to be given out elsewhere, and he was going to take it to a different journal. Ironically, the reviewer had caught Einstein in a mistake, which Einstein ultimately corrected. But that kind of indicates the rarity of peer review. It was not a very common thing. What happened, however, is after World War II, Ghislaine Maxwell's father, Rupert Maxwell, purchased Pergamon Press and started an ingenious, if devious, business model of multiplying the different academic journals so that universities, if they wanted to keep up with the literature, would have to subscribe to all of these different journals. Now, in the old days, you'd have an extremely well-read and wise editor who was helming a journal and could pretty much make the call, yeah, this is interesting, let's publish it, or no, that's not worthwhile, let's not publish it. Well, how do you find dozens of such extremely talented people to helm all these new journals? The answer is you really can't. So what they did was popularize peer review. So a less competent, still very competent, but not genius level editor would accept papers, would farm them out to other academics in the area to get their opinions on whether it should be published. Those opinions would be provided for free back to the editor. The editor would make the publication decision and then send the journals out where universities and researchers have to pay high prices in order to access this vast explosion of new papers. So peer review in the modern sense is really more of a new innovation to help the economies of scale of running large numbers of journals at the same time. We can do another question. Let's look at government funding of science. It really exploded after World War II. Was that something for the better or for the worse? Which panelist would like to tackle that question?
Oh, I'll start again. So we're follow the money. So I was thinking about that, right? After World War II, everything else. So you had innovators before that. I mentioned like the Wright brothers and various other people who developed things. And after World War II, the government just, for some reason, was bloated after World War II. And then I think people had to defend their jobs. So that's where you started getting into different types of projects, and then sinking money into it. But prior to World War II and go older, especially like in the arts and stuff like that, it was like wealthy patrons in the church funded a lot, so that people could focus on their activities or whatever they're going to do. Mozart wrote, well, actually, maybe not a good example, but anyway, people would, had a patron and write. Then all of a sudden you get into universities, then now I'm just thinking out loud. Universities went to land grants. Land grant universities got tied back to the government. Government fed things, hopefully get things out of it. I'm sure there's money involved somewhere. Oh, hey, I know you're developing that. Let me invest in that. Oh, now I'm making money. So I'm a senator. That's how I become rich. I'm somewhere around there, maybe? That's a train of consciousness. But I think it starts to become about money than looking for the next, someone developing the next great thing, and how can I get tapped into it? Even the company I work for, which is an agricultural, we tap Purdue University for ideas and students and thoughts and people and developing things. So there's some tie in there. Sorry for the string of consciousness, but it's a great question. I think it's all about the money and who controls the flow of money and how can I justify my job.
Yeah, I think that's largely correct. You have sort of the cycle of, if you've ever read the book Seeing Like a State, if you haven't, I highly recommend it. But essentially what you measure gets done. And you have this cycle of academics basically spending their time writing grants, trying to figure out what the minimal publishable unit is, because that's how you get money, is by putting out these publishable units. And they are not thinking big picture. They're just trying to, again, essentially keep the grant cycle flowing. In theory, it could work that you do enough of these, then you have the space and the funding to do some big thinking, but in practice, it rarely, if ever, works out that way. So you have people essentially making these marginal contributions that are as small as possible, that don't really do much. And that's all because the money is coming from the government, and the government measures these things by the number of papers you publish. So it's this endless cycle of not really doing much. And the counterpoint to that is Bell Labs. You had a private industry that took a very long-sighted view of giving talented people gobs and gobs of money and freedom, and saying, I don't care what you're going to focus on, but you better be the best at it. And Bell Labs was a modern miracle.
Question back there.
Let me look at the, hold on a second, let me get you the wireless mic. You got this thing for a reason. Go ahead, excellent. There you go.
How prevalent is peer review shopping?
I'm not an academic, so I don't know how prevalent it actually is.
If anybody could take a guess. I don't know the answer. I'm curious.
It's pretty prevalent. I was able to get one of my papers published in a peer-reviewed journal, but it was definitely a case where I knew the guy who was organizing the special issue that it appeared in. So I would have had a much more difficult time approaching random strangers and getting them to publish my work.
And why is that?
Because one, there are a lot of publications out there. There's a whole lot of noise coming out. People are looking for excuses to reject an article and move on. So if you're doing something that is weird or non-standard, well, it looks funny, so let's get rid of it and move on to the next paper. So you need someone who is receptive to new ideas and willing to take a good look at them in order to get it past them.
Y'all have hammered on peer review, I think, pretty fairly, pros and cons, as part of the issue with science publication and distribution. What about the other parts of science that I think are not, of actually doing science, actually running experiments and coming up with conclusions and putting them out to people that are not well put out and understood by the lay public, like confounders for that matter, and a pre-experiment publication of what your aim is? Or is there a way to get that further out into the basics of doing science into the lay population so they know to look for that?
Yeah, that's definitely something that would be very helpful, and I think there are people who are aware of problems, like, for instance, the replication crisis, and they're taking concrete steps to do things about that, to, like you said, have a pre-publication of here is what our result, here is our experimental design and what we're going to do, and then do the experiment, and then present the results. All too often there's a lot of cherry picking where people will just take vast amounts of population studies, for instance, look for correlations, and what do you know, if you look at 1,000 different aspects of your population, you're probably going to find one that's statistically significant at the 1 in 1,000 level somewhere in the big set of data you've collected. But
But if you don't know what you don't know, that's still, I think, a legit way of finding a thread to go tug on.
well, it is a legit way to find a thread to go tug on, but the problem is all too often it's presented as, we've proven this causes that, instead of, hey, we found an interesting correlation that may or may not be significant. But let me finish. I wanted to make sure I had, how many more people have questions that way? Okay, I'll make sure I leave some time for questions. I'll have one final question I want our panelists to, oh, I'm sorry, yes.
I had 2 pages of notes written on this topic. But listening to my colleague who mentioned Bell Labs made me think of, wait a moment. In Europe, they have what are called, or they used to have what are called design studios. So the French, under de Gaulle, they created design studios. So France, so Électricité de France, which is had a design studio in Roscoff in Brittany. And the way it worked is 5 or 6 people would get together. A physicist, a technician, a control engineer, a mathematician, and a guy and a jack of all trades. They get together and they go talk to the boss and say, we have an idea, we'd like to work on it for 5 years. Okay, that's fun, go to it, here's the money. And every year they come along and say, well, we've done this and done this. Oh yeah, that sounds good. And they produce some of the most astonishing stuff. Year after year, decade after decade. At one point, I forget under which presidential administration it was, the MBAs arrived. And they said, we're going to do things differently. And we're going to do top-down planning of the research. In 6 months, institutions that had produced year after year for decades world-class research, in 6 months the organization was destroyed. Exactly the same thing happened with the Airbus design studios. An American MBA was put on top of Airbus, and he closed all the design studios so that Airbus would be brought down to the level of Boeing. And we've all heard of the problems of Boeing. Well, believe me, Airbus is going in the correct direction as well. It's disastrous. The successful science takes place when you have faith in the capacities of the scientists, the engineers, and the technicians who are doing the work. If you don't have faith in their work, they're not going to produce good work. That should be obvious. But one of the problems with centralized bureaucratic institutions that don't have that faith in the work of these people is you end up trying to talk to these uncultured dolts that I mentioned previously, who have no idea what the technical or conceptual problems happen to be, and who are going to make decisions on random criteria. And this is without even talking about nefarious political agenda that might be behind the scene.
Well, we have 5 minutes left and a lot of people in the audience who want questions, so I'm going to challenge our panelists for sudden death. Last question. 1 sentence, answer what advice you would give to young scientists.
Be independent. Don't rely on money from a source that demands you to sign a EDI type of dedication. Because there's a lot of ways to raise money without going through a government institution these days, like crowdfunding.
Okay. Well,
I would just say be brave and follow the truth wherever it leads, and don't be afraid to say it.
In French, we say, n'ayez pas froid aux yeux. Don't let your eyes get cold. What it means is don't be afraid. Don't be afraid of your shadow. Don't be afraid of your ideas. Don't be afraid of your peers. And especially don't be afraid of those in the position of authority.
my advice would be pursue your science, but make sure you have a plan B and be available. And be ready to pursue your science as a hobby project on the side if you're passionate about it, because if you try to do anything genuinely creative within a bureaucratic organization, you're liable to run into roadblocks and problems. Now, I will open the floor to questions. Raise your hand up high if you got, I see Dan has already shanghaied the microphone.
Well, before you throw back the question. Okay. So, we all saw, I think COVID was the break point for our society for trusting the science. No matter where you land on your opinions about COVID, when government says, oh, you can't gather unless you gather politically correctly outside, protesting correctly, that, I think, broke us. And now people don't believe the science at all, which is also horrible. I mean, I take a couple maintenance drugs. I imagine a lot of people here do. If we don't believe doctors and scientists, we're doomed.
Do your own research.
Well, I was going to say, but how, as a society that, was the leading technological society on the planet, can we fix it?
Not anymore.
Well, I said was. Yeah. So can we fix it, or are we just screwed?
We don't ever want to go back to that. We want to question everything.
Yeah, but I mean, can we fix?
Well, I think that we should do your own research, take a critical look. Don't just blindly trust people. And yeah, that's hard, particularly if you're like, I'm not a biomedical researcher, but I can certainly tell when someone's giving me inconsistent results and isn't backing what their claims with evidence. So you just have to think critically and take a look at the results and make up your own mind.
All right, so following on to that, we heard a lot of people saying, "Oh yeah, you don't know about epidemiology. You don't know about all this kind of stuff." But at some point, when what the approved scientists are saying sets the bullshit flag, so how does the average person who isn't an epidemiologist know when it's time to say, "Wait a minute, you're feeding me a line here"?
That's very hard to do. You have to think critically, cultivate a variety of sources, consider what the dissidents or the people who are criticizing the ideas have to say, and ultimately, it's up to you to make your own decision. Now, if you can find people you trust and can listen to, then all the better. But ultimately, everyone has the responsibility to make up their own mind and take into account what scientists or authority figures are saying, but you should never trust the science blindly. I'll let our panelists have a final comment before we conclude the panel. If you want to.
Yeah, I'll lead off. So I was just thinking about instead of all doom and gloom, I was thinking about this. There's a YouTube thing I've been following pre-COVID and all the way through. It's still going on today. It's called Samson's Boat Company. If you want to find it, it's a bunch of millennials that are restoring a 1901 racing yacht from the ground up. I didn't know anything about shipbuilding. I've been watching it for 7 years, and I know a lot more about shipbuilding than I knew, than when I started. It is fantastic, well produced, well done, and actually gives me faith in the youth, because the boat's called Tally Ho, so you just do that and find it. And he is, spoilers, the boat's been rebuilt, and now he's selling it from the Seattle area all the way back to England to redo a race that it won back in 1902 for an anniversary.
A brief comment, please, Joe.
Oh, sorry. But I would watch that, and that gives me faith in the youth of the world on science, because it's all science, being mechanical science, that is. Sorry.
I have to ask, is that still the same ship?
You know what? They tackle that question. Yeah, they do tackle that question.
One thing I would say is just, what makes science, to answer, one of the questions we asked, or at least give some guidance in that way, is, something I've always found very helpful is, what is the mechanism involved? If you're making a prediction, is there some sort of mechanism some theoretical mechanism that would make sense for this conclusion to be supported? Or is it just, there's a cause and a result, and I have no way of figuring out if there's any connection between the two? Generally, if there's not a mechanism that I can figure out, or that seems plausible, even if I don't know what it is, I tend to reject it. And if there's a mechanism, it's like, okay, then I can deal with this, then this is something that maybe we can work with, even if it turns out to be wrong.
I've been pretty pessimistic up to now, so let me change gears and give an example in which ordinary people interacted with academic research to produce a very positive result. As I stated previously, I lived for 15 years in Australia, and one of my daughters is even born there. In Australian hospitals, they had previously put babies on their stomachs. But Chinese mothers would scream and go ballistic upon seeing their children on their stomachs and run and turn them over onto their backs. So some Australian doctors noticed this and undertook some serious epidemiological studies, which confirmed that the Chinese mothers were correct. So, policy in Australian hospitals has been subsequently overturned. Here's an example of ordinary people who work based on thousands of years of collective experience, challenging the academic knowledge of the time and saying they're wrong, and we're not going to change our opinion because we know you're wrong. And then ultimately, some academics did the proper homework and said, wait a minute, they're actually correct. This is one way in which ordinary people can challenge the establishment and transform it. It takes time, it takes dedication, and it requires incredible amounts of homework. In this particular case, they had the thousands of years of experience. If it's something new, then you have to do the homework yourself. You have to study it yourself. I didn't become a historian of science simply by saying, oh, I think I'm going to use OpenAI and ChatGPT. What do you think? No, it doesn't work that way. I'm now working with 8 different languages. I had to learn them after retiring. I can read 3 books in preparation for a single post. It takes hard work. But if you don't do the hard work, you can't challenge the establishment.
Well, we've run about 5 minutes over, but I would like to thank our guests here and on the panel, and we'll try to begin with a quick break and begin at the top of the hour with our next panel, which is the history and power of narrative.